Dr. Sean Levchuck, I'm so glad to have you on the show today. I think that the most responsible thing that I can give to my audience today is some ability to satisfy their questions, their curiosities. And certainly with your experience and your firsthand knowledge, you're the type of person we're hoping to be speaking to today. So, as we sit here today, and I understand the limitations of diagnosing someone from afar, but when you saw what happened on Monday Night Football with Damar Hamlin of the Buffalo Bills, what was your reaction?
Initially, my reaction was that this was a primary cardiac event because there's very few things that are going to take out, a seemingly physical specimen like this young man is. And, I watched the hit and I said, you always worry about the helmet hitting the heart or the chest, rather. So my gut feeling was this was cardiac until somebody tells me it's not.
And tell me what you mean by it's a cardiac event. I don't know if I'm using layman's terms, but I do know that these terms seem to be used interchangeably when it comes to layman. I'm not sure that they are interchangeable for someone of your expertise, but, terms like cardiac arrest, which is what they're using in reference to Hamlin, versus heart attack or heart failure.
Okay, so cardiac arrest is a very generic term, but just something that causes the heart to stop working. Now, it could be an arrhythmia. It could be anything that would require CPR, a heart attack, or whatever. This is a young man, so you break the diagnosis down into two things. You say, is it an acquired defect? In other words, did something happen to him over the better part of the last couple of months or days or weeks that he acquired, like an infection or something like that? Or is this a congenital problem? Did he have something since he was born that had not been picked up or had gone undiagnosed? So that's kind of how you have to, kind of divide it up, I think, in terms of this particular case.
Okay, so what you're describing to me is an underlying issue that was revealed in the moment of this hit on the football field, either congenital or acquired.
Yeah, the outlier to that is what we call commotio cordis, where you actually get a shot to the chest in the area of the heart at the precise time of the electrical vulnerability of the heart that puts someone into an arrhythmia. Now, that's common, a lot more common in lacrosse injuries, where someone will get hit by a ball. Lacrosse ball is very heavy. It's not common as a rule, but it is something more seen in that. And that's why I looked at the helmet shot to his chest, which didn't seem terribly hard, but it may have just been enough. So that's kind of the outlier there.
In your estimation, then, that's a lower probability than the potential underlying issue revealed in that moment on the football field?
No, I think they're probably all in play at this point.
So, Doctor, I talked about this in the past. I've talked about it on this particular episode of this podcast. When I first joined working at ESPN, I'm now at Fox News Channel, I worked for the investigative unit outside the lines, and one of my first pieces was on commotio cordis. And I began to understand it to some extent and how incredibly rare it is. And exactly what you said, it seems to show up when it does in sports like lacrosse or baseball. And I did see in my investigation some instances in soccer. Any time when there was a fast-moving object that came into contact with the chest. I didn't see any instances of it in football. Have you seen that in your career?
No. Most of the issues with football, in terms of sudden death or near sudden death in the cardiac setting of football, typically involves something like hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which is an underlying issue that, the draft pick for the Rangers had that a few years ago, that he died on the bench. And, there's been, several other players over the years, professional athletes, that have been blindsided by that, but, in this case, it's just, obviously everything's, like I said, still in play.
And there was an instance, for example, a few years ago when a hockey player named Chris Pronger took a hockey puck directly to the chest, and in his description, his heart skipped a beat. So what is it? And by the way, Chris Pronger had a full recovery from that event. So what is it that happens? We're not going to assume for the moment that this is what happened to Damar Hamlin, but if I am to understand what commotio cordis is, what is it that happens when an object hits the chest at just the wrong moment?
Well, the cardiac muscle is basically just, it responds to the electrical impulses. So you've got two batteries in the heart, one at the top of the heart, one in the middle of the heart, and then you've got these wires that kind of spread through the heart muscle, but they pass the electrical impulses through the heart. And they're basically sodium and potassium and calcium channels. If you get a shot at just the right time, while that cardiac action potential is in its, quote, unstable time, in theory, you could set somebody into a ventricular arrhythmia. That's...
and why would it be even more rare in football? Is it because it's the object, in this case, you said you looked at the helmet, it could be a shoulder pad, I assume, as well. Is it because it's essentially not, I don't know if I'm using the right word here, but acute enough that the mass of a helmet or a shoulder pad is too distributed, whereas a lacrosse ball is very focused and could therefore strike right at the heart?
Yeah, and the lacrosse ball is moving pretty fast compared with what the ground speed of a football player is, and most of the times football players can kind of brace themselves for the hit too. Whereas lacrosse ball, a lot of these just come out of the blue, and some of these Division I lacrosse players can sling it pretty hard. So that you're talking about a heavy ball coming over 100 miles an hour. That hits, it hits the right spot, it could really do some damage. So I think that's probably why. I think hockey pucks are a little lighter, and hockey pads do kind of cover that area a little bit. Maybe also why you don't see it as much. A lot of these lacrosse players don't wear a lot, over the heart area.
One of the other things that came up in my research is this primarily happens, and again, even though it's an extremely rare event, it when it does happen, it primarily happens in young men whose chests aren't fully developed, not a lot of musculature. I know we just mentioned Chris Pronger, and he's a well-developed man that plays hockey, but just again, kind of calculating the probabilities here, this is something that normally would happen, and it doesn't mean it wouldn't happen with a fully grown man, but normally would happen in an adolescent.
Absolutely, where you've got decreased, you still have a degree of skeletal immaturity, muscular immaturity. Their maturity phase hasn't kicked in enough to develop enough of an upper body, in the chest area and shoulder area to kind of blunt that trauma. So yeah, it's definitely something you see more in the adolescent age group. And
one more thing is tied back to my research. What I came across when we were doing this piece is there's really not much you can do as a preventative. You can have, I know that schools were highly encouraged to have defibrillators on AEDs on site. Maybe some padding can help, but it is such a rare bolt of lightning. There's not much that can be done preventatively.
No, they a lot of the teams encourage heart guards and everything, and I think to some extent they probably do the trick. I had a son that was a baseball player and played in college, and when he was coming up in the ranks, in Little League, he had the heart guard, and I said to him when he went to play middle school ball, I said, kid's getting bigger. You wearing the heart guard? He goes, oh, no, because they won't let me live it down. So, the kids voluntarily don't want to wear it. But, I think to some extent, listen, it can hurt. Whether it helps, the jury's out, because like you said, it's so rare, to get a sample size enough to say, hey, these got it and these didn't because of the heart guard. It provides a level of comfort, probably more for the parent than anybody.
And then whether or not, I don't know if there's a difference whether or not it was in Damar Hamlin's case or anyone's case that collapses on a field, whether or not it's a more generalized, as you described it, cardiac event, which could be an underlying issue, or is commotio cordis, is the way that individual is treated on the field any different? What would be required in both of those situations?
No, it's pretty much the same thing. I mean, it's the all ABCs, airway, breathing, circulation. When you go into those situations, you support the airway, you assess if there's a pulse, and you begin CPR, and hopefully somebody, and I saw them last night. I mean, they were very good. The crew was amazing. They were right on it. You have an AED at field side. That's that's a game changer in a case like this. If it does turn out to be an arrhythmogenic or a cardiac arrhythmia, what everybody thinks it is. So, it's really very basic. The assessment stays the same. You don't kind of jump ahead because you took a hit. You still start from the basics of ABC.
And can you help us read into hospital lingo in terms of, I've heard language like he's now in critical condition, his vitals have returned to normal, he is intubated. I've heard that is actually all positive news. I guess that could be the case, obviously, when it's measured against survivability, when the alternative is death.
Yeah.
But is that good news that his vitals have returned to normal and he is intubated? And this time, instead of as measured against death, how about his potential return to normal?
Well, I think that's the big thing. You don't know at this point. This workup is going to take, I was joking with someone today that had asked me a question. I said, this workup this is not like the show ER where McDreamy is going to come in and snap his fingers and get the diagnosis in the 45-minute episode. The workup is going to be very long, but the fact is that his vital signs are stable, that, yes, he's on a ventilator, but that's what he should be on, because you're trying to decrease the amount of work he's doing while you try and sort things out. Once you kind of have a feel for that, the next step is to try and see what, residual, if any, issues he has. It was a cardiac arrest. It would be naive to think that, up here could not have taken a hit. You don't know. Nobody knows until you start to wake things up, and nobody outside the people that were there know the real timeline for how everything went in terms of minutes. But minutes mean minutes. You don't have a lot. So I think that they'll do a full workup. I think it's promising that he's still here with us, and I'm always a perennial optimist. Let's hope for good things.
Yeah, our prayers and thoughts are certainly with both Damar Hamlin and his family. I do want to ask you, in my estimation, my professional responsibility, and I think as anybody who's a true truth seeker, the responsible way to go about any of these situations is neither to immediately, assign blame or make a diagnosis in absence of evidence, but also not to close prematurely any potential door. So my curiosity and desire to learn the truth requires me to ask you about something that other people are talking about, and that is the potential role. We don't know if Damar Hamlin is vaccinated, if he has an mRNA vaccine. We don't know the details behind the scenes. But if that were the case, would that be pertinent information to you? Were you treating a patient in his situation?
I think that's kind of far down on the list. I think, when you're trying to amass a differential diagnosis, you kind of look for the horses rather than the zebras. So I think, there's so many layers and things that I need to think to come off the table before that even played into it. That's kind of a dicey thing. So I think, that would be, I would look at it and say that, and I view this guy more as a pediatric patient, even though he's 24, he's more in line with what I see rather than what my adult cardiology colleagues see, because they take care of 70-year-old men with blocked coronary arteries. So my differential, that's going to be down on my list. That's going to be almost like, all right, well, we have nothing else. Let's look into that, because that's kind of in off by itself.
Let me ask you about that piecemeal, though, and I think this is certainly within your expertise because, as you pointed out, pediatric cardiology. It is true, is it not, that we are seeing great increased incidences of myocarditis in young men? Statistically, I don't know to what level, but increased instances of myocarditis in young men who have had that particular form of vaccine.
Yeah, I mean, as someone that provides care and covers a lot of hospitals, we certainly did see the initial COVID spike in 2020. We got a fair amount of COVID-related myocarditis. When the first wave of the vaccines came out, we were getting, these very transient, bumps in cardiac enzymes. Happily, none of these, out of the ones we saw after the vaccine, ever had persistent issues, but we did see these types of things. Now, whether that's more out there now, and not just coming across my door, my office desk, or
Right.
is that died down a bit? I don't really know. I can say with a fair amount of certainty, we've never seen anybody with permanent issues or present like this. It's usually they come to the ER with chest pains. You check cardiac enzymes, they're elevated. You say, all right, well, you kind of marry the two thoughts together.
I really appreciate you addressing this, by the way. I think this is something people are starving for information on. Again, in the responsibility, like we talked about at the beginning here, not to assign blame, but to give people as much potential information as possible to arrive at the truth. So just two more questions on that. And I'm just, like I said, I want to take it piecemeal. Would it be, let's say you had a patient who did have, and I don't know, is myocarditis an example of an underlying condition you talked about at the beginning of this conversation, an acquired underlying condition?
That would fall more into the acquired condition. So,
and what you mentioned is one of the two types of one of the two underlying conditions, congenital or acquired. If myocarditis were present, would it be at all an exacerbating condition to either commotio cordis or a potential cardiac event that you, like the one you saw here with Hamlin? What I'm getting at is, is there a potential curiosity here that there's a connection between what happened on one hand that you and I are capable of saying, here's the probabilities, and then over here is this lower probability thing that is myocarditis? Is one an exacerbating factor for the other?
We certainly have kids and young adults that have collapsed suddenly in the field and found later to have a diagnosis of myocarditis. The presumption always is viral, since viral myocarditis is far and away the most common cause. Right. But, you could have other causes of it too. You got bacterial. There's so many things. Myocarditis just means that the myocardium's inflamed, as it were, and there are many things that can cause that. But, we saw years back a college football player passed on the sidelines, and it turned out he had viral myocarditis, and that does happen. Right. So, that's definitely part of the, that should be definitely part of what these guys are doing down there. And listen, he's in one of the best places in the world. He's in a major teaching hospital. I'm sure these guys, these guys are top guys, and they're going to go over him with a toothpick, and a comb. They really make sure they got everything.
Last question on this. Anecdotally, you begin to hear more and more about young people suffering from cardiac events. There was a soccer player 2 years ago, world famous soccer player, Christian Eriksen, who just dropped on the field. And then, I think 2 weeks ago, it's not just athletes, but it often happens with athletes. There was an ABC News executive producer of This Week with George Stephanopoulos, 37 or 38 years old, who also died. Are you seeing through your hospital system increased incidences of this? Again, for me, it all comes in bits and waves and anecdotally. Are you seeing a cumulative effect here, data that suggests this is on the rise?
No, not in the terms of the sudden death. I think it becomes an awareness. When we look back at him, and I hate to say that I'm old, but, I've been around the game for a long time. And, when we look back to 30 years ago, 31 years ago, when I was a young cardiology fellow in a children's hospital, we didn't have the diagnostic capabilities we do now. Now we can check cardiac enzymes on kids. We can get cardiac MRIs, which we never got before. So I think our threshold for diagnosing these is a lot different than it was. So, I think we find more because we have the ability to find more. The incidence of sudden death is pretty much the same as it's always been.
Is that right?
One or two a year, those student athletes, and that's why we always put such a premium on having the athletes properly screened before they participate in sports. Right,
and the statistics you just gave us, that's an extreme rarity. Last thing on this curiosity, I think it's connected to anything, and I fully understand who I'm quoting here. It was somebody on Twitter who said that their husband is a cardiologist and said, talk about in his career, this woman was quoting her husband, in his career, the number of people under the age of 40 that he had seen drop dead absent drug abuse was, almost none. It was negligible to none. Is that your experience as well, as far as I guess what we're talking about here is sudden death, not underlying heart issues that are diagnosed, but sudden death for a healthy young adult, absent drug abuse, to suffer a cardiac event.
So to answer your question, yeah, it's not a common thing. Yeah, I mean, like I've been at St. Francis Hospital since 1995, and I've probably seen 10. And and I'm a director of the program. So, a lot of those things come across our plate, but it's just not a common thing. I think, again, a lot of it goes to people's awareness, but, it's not very common. That's why this is so, unbelievable. I think from everybody's perspective, this whole thing with this young man is just, you sit there shaking your head.
Well, it sounds like doctors are probably trying to figure out right now, or have already, whether or not he had an underlying condition, congenital or acquired, or whether or not this was a result of a freak, extremely rare in the sport of football, hit that resulted in commotio cordis.
100%.
Okay. Really appreciate your time, your wisdom and knowledge on this, and entertaining all of my curiosities. I really appreciate that, Dr. Sean Levchuck.
No problem. My pleasure.
Take care.
All good.
Hey, it's Will Cain. Click here to subscribe to the Fox News channel on YouTube. It's the best way to get our latest interviews and highlights. And click to subscribe to the Will Cain Podcast for full episodes right now.